Morning, guys. We'll be getting started here in just a minute. All right, so let's get started. The first thing I'd like to start with is an announcement / reminder, actually two of them. One is that as some of you are aware, the department is currently interviewing candidates for a new professor in landscape design and contracting. However, what many of you might not know is that we worked and fought hard to make sure that that person would also have teaching responsibilities in landscape architecture. So that means that the new hire will be one of your professors in the upcoming semesters. And for that reason, it's important for you to make your voice heard and to know about the candidates and to submit any thoughts or evaluations that you might have about their background and their potential in the department. So the first person who is interviewing is tomorrow, and it is Chance Munns is the person's name. And tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., they're having a meeting with students. You should have received an email about that from the department. Did you guys get an email about that? Okay, good. So that has a link in it so that you can join the Zoom meeting and see their presentation and participate in Q&A. And I want to make sure that landscape architecture students are engaged in this process and that we don't just leave it up to LDC to make all the decisions. So please engage in that. And again, that's tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. The other announcement is that your second opportunity for extra credit, third opportunity for extra credit is going to be on Thursday evening. Laurie Olin is presenting. He is a legend, a luminary. He is probably, in terms of career accomplishments, the most famous of the various guests that we're bringing in for LA Days this year. So please tune in Thursday night for Laurie's presentation. He is the designer of Bryant Park in New York City, of Independence Square in Philadelphia, and a lot of other very notable landscapes across the country. So, and he's just a great teacher. He's a great public speaker, and it really knows how to tailor his presentations to student groups. So he's just a fantastic person to watch and learn from. So I encourage all of you to attend that. As usual, I'll be getting the attendance list from Laurie afterwards. Sorry, not Laurie, from Laurie. No, sorry, Kelly. So Kelly is keeping track of the attendance so that I can give credit for those of you who attended. So please make sure that you have that on your radar as well. All right, any questions about any of that before we get started with today's lecture? All good. All right. Well, I will share my screen. All right, so today's topic is landscape heterogeneity and structure. And as usual, if you have any questions while I'm presenting, just interrupt me, turn on your mic and let me know verbally if you have questions, because I can't really monitor the chats while I'm presenting. So first we'll begin with landscape heterogeneity. And in order to understand this, we need to kind of define what we mean by heterogeneity. So we'll begin actually with a definition of homogeneity, which is the quality or state of being of a similar kind or of having a uniform structure or composition throughout. So in terms of landscape ecology, the image that we see here would be considered a more or less homogeneous landscape because it's all agriculture. And not only that, but particularly in the foreground, it appears to all be the same type of agriculture, the same crop that's being grown in all of those areas. So that is a homogeneous landscape. It's not providing a lot of variety in terms of the structure or composition of that landscape. And then heterogeneity is defined as the quality or state of consisting of dissimilar or diverse elements, right? So here's another example of an agricultural landscape, but in this case, we're seeing a much more heterogeneous landscape because we also have forested areas and there are different types of crops being grown and there are orchard trees and various different types of landscapes and ecosystems. Right, so how would you characterize the landscape heterogeneity in this image? How would you describe this in terms of its heterogeneity?
Well, you mean like how there's fields and trees and forests and plains and all that?
Yep. Well, and not just the different elements that make it up, but also their composition. Anyone want to take a stab at describing the composition of this landscape?
It's like a valley or a depression. In the middle, you have fields. They almost look agricultural.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have sort of on the foothills, you have this dense sort of shrubbery or tree cover.
Yeah. And it's kind of patchy too on the hillsides, isn't it? It looks like there are places that are forested and then other places in between that either have been cut or different types of vegetation. Right. And then another aspect of this that we might look at from a landscape ecology point of view is the fact that you have a continuous row of trees here that appears to connect up with that forested area on the hillside. So, and that begins to suggest that there are ways for wildlife to migrate through this landscape because we have sort of a connected different types of vegetation that are connected together using these what are known as corridors, which we'll talk about more in a moment. Right, so it's not, so when we talk about the heterogeneity of a landscape, it's not just the different elements that make it up, but also their composition and how they're all sort of put together. How about the landscape heterogeneity here? How many different types of sort of ecosystems do you suspect we have here? Speaking on a large scale.
Maybe three.
Three, maybe. Actually, I would suggest there's maybe a few more than that, partly because of the white stuff that we see on the right side.
Maybe 4 or 5.
Right. So on the right, what we're seeing is snow up on hilltops and that or mountaintops, and that begins to suggest that there's some pretty significant topographical change here, right? So we're not just looking at the patterns of the different types of vegetation, plus the water, of course, is an aquatic ecosystem. But then you also have the snow is indicating the topographic difference. And so you have higher elevations and lower elevations, which also provide difference in that landscape. How about this? Is this a heterogeneous or a homogeneous landscape? Alonso.
I think it's a homogeneous, maybe, just because of the lines are really lined up.
Yep.
But there's a diversity within the flowers or the landscape colors.
There are. So these are actually tulip fields in Denmark. And from an agricultural point of view, this is definitely a homogeneous landscape. So even though there's different varieties of tulips being grown here, they're from an ecosystem point of view, they're all providing more or less the same type of habitat. And really it's no habitat at all because of the pesticides and various controls that farmers use to help control pests. However, the heterogeneous part of this is actually right up the middle. The trees along the roadway there provide a heterogeneity in this landscape so that there is some habitat there or a corridor for wildlife to be able to pass through this agricultural landscape. So it's a little, even though it seems insignificant in terms of the overall land area, it can be very significant in terms of landscape connectivity. All right, this is actually a forested area in Eastern Canada. So would you characterize this as a homogeneous or heterogeneous landscape?
Homogeneous.
Yep, so at this scale, it's absolutely a homogeneous or homogeneous landscape. But let's zoom in on a portion of it, right? So now what do we see? If we look at this, would you still call this a homogeneous landscape?
You can somewhat see open spaces within like the little openings in the trees.
There's absolutely some open spaces. And if you look carefully at the texture, you have sort of one texture up at the top here. There's another texture kind of down around the edges. And then in the center here, there's a third texture, right? And those textural changes are clues to the fact that there are different types of vegetation here. And in fact, what we're seeing are areas of mixed hardwoods and deciduous trees, evergreens down here in this texture, and then sort of more open shrubs or grasses down here in this open area where there aren't any trees at all, right? And so we really have three different types of landscapes in what appeared to be a homogeneous landscape when we're zoomed out. So the difference here is scale, right? And scale is a huge part of the picture when we're talking about landscape ecology. The scale at which you're looking at a landscape and the scale at which the species that you're interested in operate at are critical elements in landscape ecology, and they're something that we need to pay close attention to. Right, so understanding these issues that are associated with scale is going to be one of the essential components that we look at this semester. So these are examples of different ways that you can look at scale. So one way is by looking at grain size. Right? And grain size is basically just the level of detail at which you're looking at the landscape. When we characterize landscapes, we're typically breaking it down into sort of smaller digestible pieces. And the smaller those pieces are, the greater amount of detail we have. And that is one aspect of scale, right? So here you're seeing like on the left side, it says n equals 1. So n is just kind of the dimension of a particular unit of that landscape, right? So here we have one level of detail at n equals 4, where 4 of these boxes at the 1 scale make up 1 box at the 4 scale. We have less detail, right? But you may need to work at this level of detail if you're looking at a much larger land area. And that's the second aspect, in fact, of scale, is the extent. So you have the grain size, and then secondly, you have the extent, which is the overall land area that you're looking at, right? So we have 16 units in the first example down here, and then 81 units, and then 400 units. right? And so the land area is another aspect of scale that we need to think about. And these will vary depending on the type of species that you're interested in. So these are photos that illustrate different types of landscapes across relatively large areas in the Western US. So the first one, letter A up there at the upper left, is an undeveloped mountainous landscape in the Front Range here in Colorado. In B, we have a landscape mosaic of forest and agricultural land down in the southern portion of the United States. In C, we have an urbanizing landscape outside of Denver, right? So you can see kind of that suburban development pushing up against open space and or agricultural land. And then in D is an aerial view of clear cuts in a coniferous landscape of lodgepole pine. And this is in Targhee National Forest in Idaho. And there are actually post-harvest slash piles scheduled for burning that are in the clear cuts, right? So if you look closely in these clear cuts here, you can see kind of these darker areas, and those are essentially piles of harvested scrap that are going to be burned in a controlled burn. So
Do they,
go ahead.
sorry, do they like purposely leave the corridors for the animals and stuff like that when they plan that out?
They do, and that's one of the management aspects of national forests, is that they're thinking more and more about how landscape ecology principles work into the ways in which they utilize the forested land, right? Because the National Forest Service isn't just about conservation, it's also about how do we make the best use of those resources for human needs in terms of lumber for building, or fuel for fire and so forth. So, so there are different management practices that have been tested over the decades in national forest land. And this is one of the more recent ones where they do think about these corridors and how they can provide for wildlife when they are harvesting timber in those areas. Right.
Awesome.
And that's something that we actually see working its way into lots of development proposals, whether it be forested areas or in suburban developments. And we'll see some examples of that a little bit later in this lecture. And these are some photos that sort of illustrate the concept of landscape as a spatial mosaic at a variety of spatial scales. So in example A, we have what you might consider a micro landscape, right? So this is landscape complexity from the perspective of, let's say, a grasshopper, right? And so something that we might consider to be a homogeneous landscape, when we look at it at this scale, you can see that there are like open patches of earth, and then there are patches of weeds and patches of bluegrass, for example. And so all of those different patches matter to when you're looking at the scale of a very small organism. In example B, we have a set of experimental microlandscapes that are used to explore the relative effects of habitat abundance and fragmentation on arthropod communities in an agroecosystem. So this is thinking about in agricultural landscapes, how are different patterns of fragmentation related to arthropods in those. So, things like spiders and other organisms like that, and thinking about how those communities of insects, or well, they're not insects, but how those communities of fauna are impacted by different agricultural landscapes. And so these are different plots where they're trying different types of fragmentation to measure what the different types of fragmentation do in terms of population size and distribution across those landscapes. In example C, we have clones of Gamble oak in Colorado, which illustrates heterogeneity within approximately 1 square mile. So again, these are looking at stands of oak and looking at how that kind of how that particular species propagates itself across the landscape. And then in D, we have an aerial view of string bog landscape in Alaska. And again, this is, each of these is getting larger and larger in scale, and looking at how you can see heterogeneity at pretty much every scale that you might look at a landscape or investigate that landscape based on the species of interest. And so that scale at which we're looking at that heterogeneity is going to have an impact in terms of the way that we analyze that landscape. So part 2 is landscape structure. And first is the matrix. So the matrix is defined as something within or from which something else originates, develops, or takes form. Another definition is the natural material, such as soil or rock, in which something such as a fossil or crystal is embedded, or the material in which something is enclosed or embedded. And then in terms of landscape ecology, it's the predominant generally contiguous landscape typology in a given area in which patches are embedded, right? So the matrix is in landscape ecology terms, is sort of the background material. And it's typically the most prevalent landscape type in that particular mosaic, right? So in this particular photo, what would you say is the matrix of this photo or of this landscape?
The grass.
Yep. So the grasslands, that's the most dominant landscape type. And so that's what we would consider to be the matrix in this particular landscape. Now, the matrix is not always the same. It can be different materials. So for example, grassland is not always going to be the matrix in every landscape. It depends on what is the most dominant sort of background landscape typology in that given landscape. The next term we have is patch. And so a patch is defined as a piece of material used to mend or cover a hole or a weak spot, a small piece or scrap, a part or area distinct from that which is around it. Or again, in terms of landscape ecology, an area of habitat differing from its surroundings, often the smallest ecologically distinct landscape feature in a landscape mapping and classification system, right? And this is kind of an interesting example of a literal landscape patch of sod. But when we talk about a patch in landscape ecology, typically we're talking about sort of those units that show up as distinct from the background of the matrix. So in this particular landscape, what would you say, how would you classify the patches in this landscape?
It would be the trees.
Yep, the coniferous trees that we see here, those are the patches. Right, and then the matrix here are the lower sort of shrubby or grassland areas in between. And again, scale has an impact on what you might consider to be a patch or a matrix, and it all depends on the system or the organism that's being studied. So on the left side, we have a meadow vole. And in this case, the landscape is defined as a mosaic of grassland patches that are embedded in a matrix of forest, right? So in this case, we see that the forest is the primary landscape type. So that is the matrix. And then these individual patches of grassland make up the patches. For milkweed bugs, shown on the right side, and we see an insert of it. This is the insect here on a milkweed pod. And for that insect, it lives, feeds, and reproduces on individuals of the common milkweed plant. And each grassland area functions as a landscape of milkweed habitat patches embedded in a matrix of grass, right? So if we were to enlarge this one grassland patch from the viewpoint of the vole, then we see that from the viewpoint of the milkweed plant or milkweed bugs, that we have individual milkweed plants embedded in a matrix of grassland. So scale, again, is going to have this huge impact in terms of what you consider to be matrix and what you consider to be patch within that landscape. Next, we have corridors. And a corridor is defined as a passageway, as in a hotel or office building, into which compartments or rooms open. A usually narrow passageway or route, or in terms of landscape ecology, narrow patches that may act as links or barriers in a landscape, which influence dispersal of plants and animals, right? So in this example in the landscape below, how would you characterize the corridors? Ben, how would you characterize these corridors?
Hi, sorry, I was changing the temperature, messing with the AC. Could you repeat that?
I was just asking how you would characterize the corridors in this landscape, in this image.
I mean, it's all just tall trees. Is that what you mean by characterize?
Yep. So basically just defining like what is the corridor element in here. So it's basically the trees that are connecting together the patches of forest. So in the lower right here, we see one patch of forest. There are a couple of other sort of patches up here and in the upper right. And then we have these rows of trees that help connect together those forest patches. And so those rows of trees are considered to be corridors. And they help with the dispersal and migration of plants and animals throughout that landscape. And then corridors, of course, can take many different forms. So depending on the form that they take, they can have different characteristics. And the form that they take is often influenced by the processes that created them. So in example A, we have a simple line that's almost always an artificial construct that is a result of human development patterns. We can see an example of that in the photo here with the trees lining the street here. In example B, we have a corridor of varied width. Typically that tends to come from more natural patterns. So that can be the trees that grow along a river, for example. You also see that in terms of a braided corridor, which we see in example C. In D, we see a broken discontinuous corridor. So you may think that because it has breaks in it, it's no longer a corridor, but in fact, a corridor that is relatively continuous, even with some breaks in it, can still act as a pathway for distribution of various species. And then in E, we have a meandering corridor. And again, that typically is produced from a natural landscape process. So for a water body is the most common one. So a river or a stream or even the edges of a lake. And we can see a couple of different examples of different types of corridors in this photo over here, but the ones that are most prominently seen are these sort of straight ones, because this is an agricultural landscape. And so when you have human development like that, you typically see these sort of straight line corridors. Right, and corridors typically function as travel lanes for individuals that are moving within their home range. They're dispersal routes for individuals that are traveling between habitats. And where these are interconnected, they form networks. So networks means that you have a complex of multiple patches with multiple corridors and various routes for individuals of a given species to be able to move from one patch to another. Corridors can encourage gene flow among subpopulations, and they help reestablish species and habitats where they've gone locally extinct. So again, they help with that dispersal so that individuals can move and colonize new areas, or they can help with the gene flow and the genetic variety within a given population. Corridors along streams and rivers are riparian habitat, and they're used by many different types of animals. In Europe, hedgerows have a long history, And there are typical plant and animal hedgerow communities. And then when we talk about urban and suburban areas, corridors provide habitat for edge species and places for birds to stop over during migration. So, so these corridors are actually a really crucial link in landscapes, particularly in human developed landscapes, because they provide one of the last ways for various species to disperse through the landscape. Right, so here we see an example of some hedgerow corridors in an agricultural landscape. And typically when we talk about corridors, we're talking about vegetation that is of a similar or the same type as the patches that they're connecting together. And that's important because when species are dispersing through those corridors, they need to have appropriate habitat because they can't always necessarily traverse the entire distance of the corridor in a short amount of time. And so typically we're talking about plants that are similar to the patches that they're connecting. Many corridors are made by humans. So narrow line corridors include things like hedgerows, lines of trees, bridges over streams, highway medians, and so forth. So anywhere that there are kind of long linear vegetated corridors, or even sometimes non-vegetated corridors, as in the case of a bridge over a stream, they can still allow for dispersal of species that, you know, cannot get past that stream, for example. So depending on the species type that you're looking at, there are different appropriate types of corridors for dispersing that species. The next element that we'll talk about is an edge. And so an edge is defined as the line where an object or area begins or ends, the narrow part adjacent to a border, or in terms of landscape ecology, it's the portion of an ecosystem near its perimeter where influences of the adjacent patches can cause an environmental difference between the interior of the patch and its exterior. It's also defined as a transition zone between a patch and matrix or between two adjacent patches, right? And edges have an ecology all their own because they are influenced by both the matrix or the adjacent patch as well as the patch of which they're a part. So you have an entirely different community of species typically living in these edge areas than you have in the interior of the patches or out in the matrix that they adjoin. Right, so here's an example of a landscape edge. So in this case, we have the edge of an aquatic environment of a pond, which is a transition zone from the open water to the more terrestrial wetlands. Right, and you can see different types of ecosystems here. And so, for example, some of the shrubby areas might be considered an edge to the forested landscape that you see in the background. And again, that edge can almost be considered an ecosystem all its own because the plant and animal communities that you find there are so different from what you find in the more interior portions of the patch. And then we also have boundaries. So a boundary is defined as something that indicates or fixes a limit or extent. It's also a political or administrative delineation separating inside from outside. Or in landscape ecology, it's the area where two landscape edges meet, or an abrupt spatial change in landscape typology that may inhibit movement across the landscape. That 3B definition is the one that we'll be most interested in this semester. Boundary is sometimes used interchangeably with the term edge, but boundaries are generally considered to be very abrupt edges. So they're not really transition zones. They tend to be a very abrupt edge where one type of landscape changes into another type of landscape. Or they can be anything that inhibits movement across a landscape. So what we see in this image here is a human boundary or a human design boundary that is very much intended to inhibit movement across the landscape. So in this case, it's probably intended to either keep out wildlife or keep in cattle, for example, in a pasture for grazing. So in general, edges are defined by a more naturalistic condition, while boundaries are typically a more artificial condition that require human intervention to maintain. So in a natural condition, edges are generally what develop because of the natural influences and forces that create for a more gradual transition in landscape types. Whereas to have a true boundary, you need human intervention to maintain that boundary. And of course, when you have an agricultural condition, that is typical of a boundary that you might find in a landscape mosaic. So the boundary between agricultural fields and adjacent forests is maintained by the continued mowing and tilling of the ground in the agricultural fields, which creates an abrupt change in landscape type, right? So in this case, there isn't really much of an edge to the forest. It goes straight from agriculture to forested land, and that is a boundary that's maintained by human activity. If this was allowed to go fallow and natural forces and processes were allowed to operate on this landscape, then you would see the evolution of a more gradual landscape edge along those forested patches. So here we have some diagrams that depict different types of boundaries. So first, in example A, we have a narrow, sharp, abrupt boundary that's created where the edges of two patches meet. And again, typically defined by human activity to maintain that boundary. In example B, we have a wide boundary that's created, that creates an ecotone between two adjacent patches. And again, this is typically when we get into wide boundaries, we more often than not refer to that as an edge. In example C, we see a convoluted boundary. And then in example D, we have a perforated boundary. And a perforated boundary is where you have areas that have a sharp definition in that boundary, and then areas where you have a more gradual edge between the two opposing conditions. And the shape and width of boundaries can vary quite a bit. So when you have broader, more gradual borders or edges, then it's considered an ecotone. And that forms a transition between the patches or the patch and its matrix. And boundaries connect patches through fluxes and flows of materials, energy, and organisms. So the gradients of conditions such as things like wind flow, or moisture, or temperature, or solar radiation between the patches or between the patch and its matrix are influenced by the edge or boundary, right? And things like the height, width, and porosity of that boundary become important in terms of how much those influences are going to affect the conditions in that ecotone. Boundaries can also restrict or facilitate the dispersal of seeds and the movement of organisms in the landscape. So, and this is something that we'll talk about more as we get into more detail later in the semester about edges and boundaries. But typically when you have a boundary, that's a sharp delineation between two different landscapes, that tends to inhibit the movement of species. And when you have an edge, so that's a more gradual transition zone, that tends to help encourage the movement of species across that landscape. And the other thing to keep in mind is that boundaries are dynamic. They change in both space and time. And so a boundary between a forest and a field that has an abrupt difference in vegetation can change over time. Right. So in this case, we have a very abrupt boundary. So we have an area that's mowed and maintained next to a forest area, and you get a very vertical structure to that boundary. But over time, if that's allowed to evolve without further human input, then you tend to get a differing vertical structure, where instead of it being a perfectly vertical line, it tends to get a curvature to it where you get different species that create that transition zone between the grassland and the forest, with edge species like shrubs and other types of plants colonizing that transition zone. Right, and as more time goes on, the width of that edge tends to increase, and the sort of conditions within that edge will change as you move across from the area that's predominantly grassland to the area that's predominantly forest, and becomes a much more gradual transition zone. And as you move from the vertical structure to the sort of, excuse me, the straight vertical structure to the more curved vertical structure, you move from inhibition of species movement to encouragement of species movement. And here we have a diagram of a matrix patch corridor complex. And here we see that the edges are transition zones between the landscape types, while the boundary in this case is a political or administrative delineation that may inhibit movement across the landscape. So in this case, it's a fence denoting a property line. This is a typical symbol that's used in landscape plans for a fence. And that is creating inhibition for certain species to be able to move across that landscape. So whereas you may have had movement of species in the past between these patches, they can't necessarily all intermingle anymore because now you have a boundary that's inhibiting the movement of those species. So here we have matrix, patch, and corridor all together in a landscape mosaic. So how would you describe this particular landscape? Well, let's go with Eric this time. So Eric, if you had to define or describe this landscape, what would you say is the matrix, what is the patch, and what is the corridor?
I would say probably the corridor would be the streets. And then the matrix would be like the houses, I guess. And I'm not quite sure about the third one, to be honest.
Okay, so you got 1 out of 3 there. So
Okay.
In this case, the matrix is actually the suburban development, because that's the most sort of prolific landscape type that we see here, right? Is all the houses and the development. And within that context, the patches are actually these areas of forest. And then that means that the corridors then are anywhere that you get linear areas of trees that connect together different patches. So you can see a linear area of trees along here and along some of the streets. And so those would be considered the corridors that can connect together the patches of forested area.
So Scott, I guess that brings up a question then. So
Yep.
like, so in that photo, like there's corridors for human use.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I mean, there'd be corridors of where you find different ecosystems. So I guess like, how do you determine the difference between like a human corridor and like an animal or vegetative corridor?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And in landscape, when we're talking about landscape ecology, the focus is almost always on ecosystems and populations of animals other than humans. So we're thinking about bird species and mammals and rodents and things of that nature. So we're almost always looking at it from the point of view of species other than humans. So that was a great question. So in this case, we're looking at it from the point of view of the animals that live in this landscape and how they get around and what their patches of habitat might be. All right, so if we're looking at a landscape like this, how would you describe this? What would be the matrix, what would be the patches, and what would be the corridors? Yan Rong, you want to take a stab at this one?
Sorry, I have no idea about that. Cause yeah, sorry.
Okay, let's try someone else. Let's try Emma.
I'd say the matrix is the forested areas, and
Good.
then the patches would be the larger bodies of water, and the corridors would probably be the smaller creeks and rivers that we can't really see because of the tree cover, but the smaller water creeks that connect those patches of bodies of water.
Bingo. So that is correct. So again, the matrix is always the most prevalent landscape type. And we're so accustomed to thinking about it in terrestrial terms that it's easy to forget that bodies of water can be patches within a matrix of terrestrial land types. So here we have forested matrix, the bodies of water, they're the patches, and then the corridors, as Emma correctly indicated, would be the flowing water between those, or maybe it's not, maybe it's still water that connects together those larger bodies of water, and that those provide migration routes or dispersal routes for various types of fish and amphibians that live in those aquatic environments.
Could the more open grassy parts in that one still be a patch as well, though?
Absolutely. So from the point of view of maybe certain rodent species, for examples, then the open areas of grasses that we see embedded in here, those are also patches, right?
Okay.
So yeah, so there isn't just one patch type in a given landscape. There's usually multiple types of patches within that landscape.
And it's about the scale then. It's not like if you were to zoom in closer to this picture, then that grassy part would probably be more of the patch than the,
Absolutely. Yep. Or if you zoom in enough, the grassy area could become the matrix.
Okay.
So yeah, so scale is part of it, and then the species. So when we're studying different landscapes and landscape ecology, we're usually looking at it from the point of view of a particular species or community of plants and animals. And so the particular species that you're interested in is usually what determines what you would define as the important patches within that landscape. All right, here's another example. Let's do one more this time. Let's go with Bryce.
So I guess the matrix would be the grass, the patches would be the irrigated farmland, and the corridor is the wooded areas.
So, well, there are arguments to be made for going either way with this, right? So you could say that the agricultural land is the matrix because that's the most prevalent. Or it's hard to tell, actually. There's a lot of forested land here too, right? So the forest could be the matrix. I would say, and then depending on, which way you go with that, the corridors could either be the tree-lined areas, or they could be kind of the open grassy strips that you see connecting areas together. So it varies depending on, again, what your point of view is. So this one was a little bit of a trick question because there's enough, the two landscape types that could be considered the most likely candidates for the matrix are more or less in equal distribution. So it's really hard to tell which one is the matrix, right? So you have a very large, maybe patch of forest on the left here, or you have a large patch of agriculture on the right, depending on your point of view. And again, at this scale where you have kind of an equal mix of both, the species that you're interested in studying would be the determining factor in terms of figuring out which one you consider to be the matrix and which one are the patches.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, so sorry for that. That was kind of a trick question, but
it's all good.
All right, and then the final definition we have is mosaic, which is a term I've already been using. And mosaic is defined as a surface decoration made by inlaying small pieces of variously colored material to form pictures or patterns. It's something resembling a mosaic, or in landscape ecology, a heterogeneous landscape complex composed of a matrix, patches, and or corridors. right? So this entire landscape taken together is what we would consider to be a landscape mosaic, right? So you have the matrix of the grasslands, you have the patches of forested areas or patches of agriculture, depending on your interest, and then corridors of either trees or open grassland that connect together the patches, depending again on your specific interest within this landscape. And you'll notice that a lot of the terminology in landscape ecology is borrowed from very, instead of kind of coming up with a whole jargon for landscape ecology, you know, that could be confusing. I think it was smart of the sort of early researchers in landscape ecology to borrow terms from that are in sort of the popular consciousness and that people can kind of understand readily. So mosaic is, you know, when you think of like a tile mosaic, it bears a, you know, a pretty strong resemblance to a landscape mosaic when you think about having these different landscape types that are assembled to create different sort of patterns within the landscape. So here's an example of a landscape mosaic that's been mapped in GIS. And in this case, different colors represent different landscape types, right? So we have we have water, and then conifer. Water, we have coniferous trees, deciduous trees, buildings, grasses, impervious surfaces, wetlands, shrubs, and then bare ground, right? And then you can see at the different scales here how those different materials have been mapped out in GIS so that you can begin to analyze those landscapes using GIS, which is something that we will be doing in a couple of weeks when we begin to move into GIS and looking at how that technology has really been a transformative part of the development of landscape ecology as a discipline, and some of the tools in there that we can use to analyze heterogeneous landscapes. All right, and then part 3 of today's lecture is landscape ecology applications to landscape architecture and land planning, which we will be kind of touching on throughout the semester, because that's really why we study landscape ecology as landscape architects, is to think about how it can impact our land use decision making. So this is a conventional development pattern that we saw through most of the 20th century, where if you're putting in a housing development, most of the housing is sort of equally distributed throughout that piece of land that's available for development. You have more or less equally sized, large size parcels of land, and a network of roads that connects it together. So there are a couple of problems with this pattern of development. One of those is that the forest blocks become fragmented, right? So instead of having more contiguous forested areas, you tend to get these sort of smaller patches of remnant forest scattered throughout the site. In this case, the development extends right up to the regulated edge of the wetlands. So we have some wetlands. You can see that there's a stream corridor that goes along here with a riparian landscape around it. And the development goes right up as far as it can to the edge of that wetland. And in most jurisdictions, you have required setbacks from wetlands that you cannot disturb that define what the limit of development is for that particular jurisdiction. And in this case, we see that development's going right up to the edge of what's considered to be the wetland boundary in this landscape. No pasturelands remain, so some of the rural character that may have been in this landscape is lost. We have roads that are built over stream crossings, which can pollute the water with oil, salts, and sand. So anything that might get washed off of that roadway in a rainstorm would then pollute or contaminate the other landscapes that it's bridging over. 100% of this site is developed, right? They've used every square inch of land that's available and they've developed it. So now let's look at the alternative, which is conservation development, right? So conservation development is a zoning technique in which the character that defines the features of a parcel are identified and protected before that land is developed. So it differs from traditional development in that the assessment of natural resources rather than the identification of building sites is the first step in the process. So rather than saying, okay, how can we maximize this piece of land for development? Instead, we're looking at what are the natural resources on the site and the natural ecosystems, and how can we preserve those as we develop this area for housing, for example. Conventional zoning follows rigid standards for lot sizes, road frontage, and other requirements, but it results in a uniform grid-like development pattern where most of the open space is consumed. But in conservation development, we take an alternative approach. So, some of the advantages of conservation development include the fact that scenic views are preserved from the street. So as you're going by, instead of seeing garage doors or the backs of houses, you're seeing more open space. You also get more meaningful open space so that scenic pastures and meadows are maintained. These can also serve as habitats for different types of wildlife. The vegetative buffer protects the wetlands and enhances stream water quality. So you can see, instead of building right up to the edges of the wetland, there's an expanded vegetated forested buffer along that wetland that helps protect that water resource. You have large interrupted tracts of forested woodland, right? So instead of being broken up into lots of tiny patches of woodland, you have much more contiguous patches of woodland. And you can see that in areas where the development pattern intersects with the natural ecologies, they've provided as small a break as possible in the corridor so that you can have more continuous dispersal of species from one patch to another, right? And in this particular example of conservation development, 50% of the open space is protected in perpetuity, and the more rural character of the community is preserved. So there are a lot of advantages to developing in a more conservation-minded method as opposed to the traditional methods, which just consume as much of the open space as possible for development. So any questions about those kind of distinctions between conservation development and more traditional patterns of development? All right, I will take that as a no. That pretty much wraps up the lecture for today, unless there are any other questions. We'll be talking more. Let me stop this screen share. We'll be talking more in future lectures about implications of landscape ecology for landscape architecture and urban design and land planning, and how we can use some of the lessons from landscape ecology to make better decisions in our landscape architectural plans and and specifically at the larger scales for land use planning and urban design. So if there are no other questions, that is it. Again, I really encourage you to take part in the student presentation tomorrow of the candidate for the LDC/landscape architecture faculty position, and offer any feedback you may have to the department. So that's it, and I will see you guys on Thursday.
Scott, I had a quick question. I've been trying to get ArcGIS set up. Okay. And I had GIS last semester, so I already had a license to it, and it's on a different computer that I don't have access to anymore. And
yeah, so
for some reason that's making it hard for me to re-download it.
Yeah, so if you go on Canvas, I've posted instructions for getting it downloaded and installed. ArcGIS Pro is the one that you want to be using. Yeah. So those instructions are on Canvas, and then you should have received an email this semester from Esri with your login, username, and password, or a way to set up an account with ArcGIS Online, because you need those credentials to log into the software once you install it.
Yeah, so I did all that. I went through the email, but now they don't want to give me the license because I was already licensed last semester, and I can't figure out what the.
Okay, so in that case, what I would recommend is you need to contact Diane Noren at Ramtech. She's the one who manages all the licenses for ArcGIS across the campus. and let her know the issues that you're having so that she can help you get it set up for the semester. So that's Diane, D-I-A-N-E. Actually, here, let me open up a Word document so I can, or actually, no, I'll do it in the chat here. So in the chat window, I'll give you her email address so that you can contact her, diane.noren@colosstate.edu.
Okay, great.
So send an email to Diane and let her know the issue that you're having, and she should be able to help you get set up.
Okay, great. Thanks, Scott.
Yep. Any other questions or?
Thank you.
Yep. See you guys on Thursday.
Have a good one.
You too.